We'll move back into biological world now. Our next speaker is Matt Nicholson of MBE, who will be talking about parasites as predators and prey items. So, take it away.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for braving the cold and showing up this morning. It really goes to show sort of what we'll do to get a free meal and a drink ticket. So I'm a postdoc in Paul Sickles' Parasite Ecology Lab. It's the same lab I did my PhD in. And while we study, we also advanced the slide prematurely. While we study mostly various species of parasites, the one that we focus on most often is the gnathiid isopod. But before I get into gnathids, I wanted to get into what I mean when I say connected, that gnathids might be the most connected organisms in the ocean. Well, one thing I'm not talking about when I say connected is connectivity. So I'm not talking about habitat connectivity or anything like that. I'm also not talking about how you feel when you leave the ayahuasca retreat. I'm talking about food webs and one of the most important properties of food webs, specifically a topological food web. Now, while there's many different kinds of food webs, this type of food web, my slides keep advancing. This type of food web focuses mostly on just the existence of interactions. We're not concerned with how often they do or don't happen, just whether or not they occur in nature. And a topological food web lets us take into account things like the distribution of feeding links, the species diversity, and how resolved the food web is, so how broadly or finely we're grouping different animals. And it allows us to sort of determine how robust or fragile a system might be. And connectance is the connectivity I'm sort of talking about. Connectance is, out of all the possible feeding links that you could have in a system, how many are actually there? Because, of course, you're never going to have everybody that eats everything in a food web. And so connectance typically is one of the most explanatory properties of a food web, and food webs with a higher degree of connectance are typically more robust. Now, food web ecology and food web theory started sort of being developed in the in the late 1920s, and throughout the first few decades of food web ecology and the development of food web theory, there were some problems that we didn't know we had. We developed a lot of rules and we inferred a lot based on the food webs that were being put together, but we didn't realize at the time that we were missing some really key groups and species. And at the time, a lot of the cryptic and small organisms and species were sort of thought to be not very critical to the overall big picture, and any sort of contribution they made to the structure or function of the food web was sort of a drop in the bucket. And so I sort of think of the initial development of food web theory, I'm kind of a Disney adult, so I think of it like the Haunted Mansion, the stretching room in the Haunted Mansion, where we had part of the picture for a long time, and we sort of came up with rules and ideas of what's going on, and then eventually, when you see the full picture, you realize that maybe there's a different context to the story that we've been looking at all along. And so my favorite example of this is this food web that was developed in 2009. It's a food web of a sub-Antarctic lake. And spoiler alert, this first food web has no parasites in it. This is just the sort of typical consumer resource predator-prey interactions that you would have. And all these different boxes are various groups of organisms. And this was made, of course, with no parasites, and we can see how the distribution and how all the different feeding links shake out. And then they made the same food web while adding in parasites. And so all the red lines are feeding links that involve parasites. And in the second one, I think, I have to check the paper again, but I think it was like 54% of all the feeding links in the system involve a parasite. And so this dramatically changes the context of this food web and sort of how we look at it and what and how it might respond to different types of change. And so this is just one example of an increasing body of literature over the last maybe 10 to 15 years that sort of finds that cryptic organisms, and specifically parasites, are actually really critical parts of food webs in terms of biomass flow, in terms of affecting food web topology. They really are kind of major movers and shakers in the food web. But one problem with even the newer parasite food web literature is a lot of it was developed using endoparasites. And endoparasites, of course, live inside of the host. Not much has really looked at ectoparasites, which, of course, live on the outside of the host. And so that's where we move into our poster child for ectoparasites in the ocean, the gnathiid isopod. So gnathiids are small, temporary ectoparasites that are really similar to ticks and mosquitoes on land in that they hop onto a host, normally a fish. They feed on, they remove blood for a few hours, and then they hop off, they go down and digest. And so they feed 3 different times during their life history. They feed once during each of 3 juvenile stages. They don't feed as adults. And so in 2 of our recent studies that have come out over the last year, we looked at gnathiids effectively as both consumers and prey items. The first study on the left was part of Gina Hendricks' PhD. She's not talking about this study today, so I can. And in this study, we used wild-caught gnathiids that were caught using a light trap apparatus, and they came into us fed. We didn't know what they fed on. And when I say that we sequenced the blood meals, I mean that Gina sequenced the blood meals. And essentially, we were able to determine what all these wild-caught gnathiids were feeding on. And prior to this study, we had a decent idea that they fed on a lot of different fish species. We didn't really know how many. We had a list of maybe like 15 or so that we had confirmed in the literature that they fed on. But after this study, we upped that number to at least 87 different species of fish that gnathiids will feed on. We also know from a different study that they'll feed on some soft-bodied invertebrates. And then on the other side of things, this was part of my PhD, I looked at the stomach contents, whether it was dissection or fecal matter, to look to see what species of fish on the reef are consuming gnathiids. We know that cleaner fish, which are sort of iconic and famous for picking parasites off of larger fish, we know that they eat gnathiids. We know they eat tons of them, but we didn't know with all the other species out there who might or might not also be consuming them. And so in this study, we confirmed another 34 feeding links of fish that are consuming gnathiids. And I think that was 34 out of, 62 species that we sampled. But that doesn't include some of the congeners that exist on these reefs. So for example, we sampled longfin damselfish, and we found that occasionally longfin damselfish, even though primarily herbivores, they're nominally invertebrates, they will occasionally consume some gnathiids. We didn't sample the closely related and living in a similar habitat, Stegastes adustus, the dusky damselfish. So it would make sense that they would also sometimes consume them. And of course, because I know everybody here at Rosenstiel loves corals, I have to give corals a shout out. Corals are also a predator and consumer of gnathiids. This was from a different study. But when we put all of these feeding links together, it's making sort of an interesting picture here. Because if we look at some of the coral reef food webs who have published their kind of most connected species, it's often top predators. Right, so this study from 2004, the most connected taxa across these 3 food webs that they looked at are all predators. It's normally upper level carnivores or omnivores that tend to be the most connected. And then in another study, the most connected species was, this was a near shore reef habitat. The Pacific cod was actually the most connected group with 124 feeding links. And what we know of gnathiids right now, without adding in any of the sort of additional ones that we can imagine probably feed on gnathids or get fed on by gnathids, but we haven't confirmed it. Without even adding in those, we're at 124 feeding links for gnathiid isopods, which by my assumption right now is going to probably give them the crown for being the most connected taxa. And so if we think of what it means and why it's important to think about adding them to studies and analyses like this, gnathids really, just as a single group of organisms, they really changed the composition of the picture that we're looking at when we're thinking of a coral reef food web. And one of the main reasons they're able to do this is they sort of break one of the main rules of food webs, in that one of the main rules is that you generally feed on things that are smaller than you are. Gnathids feed on everybody regardless of size. And so going forward, I think it's going to be important to look at potentially gnathids and maybe other cryptic species that might have large influences that were initially omitted because it was just kind of thought that they weren't very important. So with that, I have to thank a bunch of people who have worked on these projects, too many to name individually. Thank you.